It was a chilly Friday morning in the small, tightly knit town of Brooksville. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills, casting a soft, golden glow on the town's humble streets. The town was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, where the diner was the heartbeat of the community. The Sunnyside Diner, a modest but charming establishment with its red and white checkered floors and the constant hum of the coffee machine, was always full of regulars. It had been around for decades, a place where people could escape the outside world for a cup of coffee and a warm meal, where conversations flowed as easily as the refills. In the center of all this was Maria, a waitress who had worked at the Sunnyside Diner for the better part of 5 years. She was in her mid-20s, with dark brown hair that she often tied back in a messy ponytail, a few stray strands escaping around her face. Her uniform, a simple, slightly faded blue apron, was a testament to the countless shifts she had worked. Despite the fatigue that often tugged at her, Maria had an infectious smile and a gentle laugh, traits that made her beloved by the regulars. She knew everyone by name, remembered their favorite orders, and always had a comforting word or a joke to lighten the mood. Today, like any other, Maria arrived at work just before 6 a.m., the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery across the street. It was still dark outside, and the only sound was the gentle patter of her shoes on the diner's wooden floor as she set her purse down in the break room. The place was still quiet, save for the occasional clinking of dishes from the kitchen as the cook, Tom, began preparing the first batch of pancakes for the early risers. The air was cool, but the warmth of the kitchen beckoned her, just as it always did. She walked over to the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, ready for another day of serving the good people of Brooksville. Maria's morning routine was simple and familiar. She started by grabbing the coffee pot, serving the first few customers who were already settling into their seats at the counter. There was Mr. Thompson, the old farmer who sat in the same booth every morning, reading the newspaper as if it were a sacred ritual. Then there was Alice, the retired schoolteacher who always ordered a hot tea and blueberry muffin. As always, Maria greeted them with a smile, asked how their day was going, and made sure their orders were just right. But there was something off today. Maria couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she felt a strange tension in the air. It wasn't much, just a slight shift in the usual rhythm of the diner. It could have been because of the weather, or perhaps because the diner had been busier than usual lately, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She pushed the thought aside and focused on her customers, who were slowly trickling in, eager to start their day with a hot meal. By the time Mr. Henderson, the owner of the diner, walked in at his usual time of 8 a.m., Maria had already served a dozen customers. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a graying beard that always seemed to be neatly trimmed. He had a serious demeanor, and although he wasn't unfriendly, he was a man of few words. People in town respected him, though they also feared his temper when things weren't going right. He was strict, but fair, at least, that's what Maria always believed. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," Maria greeted, flashing her usual smile. "Morning, Maria," he muttered in return, giving her a brief nod. He didn't stop to chat as he usually did. Today, he was unusually quiet, almost tense. He slipped behind the counter, his eyes scanning the room with a look that made Maria's stomach twist slightly. It wasn't until the late morning that things started to shift. A couple of regulars had mentioned noticing something odd, a slight discrepancy in the register from the previous night's sales. The money didn't add up, and there was a small amount missing. Mr. Henderson had tried to shrug it off at first, blaming it on the late-night rush or a misplaced receipt, but as the hours passed, the feeling of something being wrong only grew. By mid-afternoon, Maria could see the change in Mr. Henderson's mood. He was no longer his usual stoic self. He seemed restless, walking back and forth behind the counter, checking and rechecking the cash register, his brow furrowed in concentration. Maria was busy with a full tray of orders, but she noticed his eyes occasionally flicking in her direction. It made her uneasy. Around 3 p.m., as the diner began to quiet down, Mr. Henderson called her into the back office. The air felt thick with tension as she stepped inside, unsure of what was going on. The office was small and cramped, with a cluttered desk in the corner. Mr. Henderson stood by the filing cabinet, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes were sharp, his jaw clenched. "Maria," he started, his voice low, "we've got a problem." Maria froze. She'd never seen him like this before, and her heart started to race. "What kind of problem?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. She hadn't done anything wrong, at least, not that she knew of, but the look in his eyes made her second-guess herself. "It's the register," he said, his tone flat. "There's a discrepancy. A big one." Maria's stomach dropped. She hadn't noticed anything unusual, but now that she thought about it, the night before had been hectic. She had worked late, and there had been a rush of customers towards the end of her shift. Maybe she'd made a mistake, but she couldn't be sure. "I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson," she said, trying to stay calm. "I'll check my receipts, but I'm sure I didn't make an error." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. There was something unsettling about the way he was watching her. "It's not just that, Maria," he said, his voice quiet but full of suspicion. "I'm starting to think, someone here is taking money. And I think it's you." Maria's face drained of color. The accusation hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She couldn't understand it. She had worked here for years, never once doing anything that would betray the trust of her boss or the customers. She had always been diligent, always showed up on time, always worked her hardest. "Mr. Henderson, you know I would never." He raised a hand, silencing her. "The numbers don't lie, Maria. The cash drawer doesn't add up. You were the last one to leave last night. No one else had access to the register." Maria could feel her pulse quicken, the walls of the small office seeming to close in on her. The accusation stung, and she fought to keep her composure. But the reality was clear, she was being blamed. Her entire history at the diner, the trust she had built, was suddenly in question. She tried to explain, to defend herself, but Mr. Henderson's expression remained unmoving. He didn't believe her. His eyes were cold, and the air between them was thick with distrust. "I know you've always been a good worker, Maria," he said, but his words sounded distant, as if he was trying to convince himself. "But the numbers don't lie. And I need to figure this out." Maria's mind raced. She had no idea how to prove her innocence. She couldn't understand how this had happened, and she couldn't fathom why Mr. Henderson would think she was capable of theft. The world around her seemed to shift, to blur as she struggled to breathe. The weight of the accusation was crushing. "I'll fix this," she said, her voice trembling, though she tried to sound confident. "I'll find a way to clear my name." But deep down, she knew things had changed. The trust that had always been the foundation of her relationship with Mr. Henderson had been shattered in an instant. And she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. As she walked back to her station, her thoughts spun. The diner, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign, full of eyes that seemed to be watching her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the whole town was starting to turn against her, and it was only a matter of time before the truth, whatever that was, would come to light. But no matter what, Maria knew one thing: she would not let this ruin her. She would find a way to prove her innocence. She had to. The next few days at the Sunnyside diner were a blur of tension and suspicion. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her. Every time she entered the diner, the usual warmth of the place seemed absent, replaced by a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. Her coworkers, who had always been friendly and easygoing, began to treat her with an unease she hadn't noticed before. They were polite, but their glances held something else, something Maria couldn't quite place. It wasn't just their eyes, it was the way they looked away when she caught them staring. It was the way their voices faltered when they spoke to her. The diner, once a place where she felt at home, had suddenly turned cold and unwelcoming. Maria had hoped that Mr. Henderson's accusation was just a momentary lapse of judgment. She thought that if she explained herself, if she could prove that she wasn't guilty, things would go back to normal. But it became clear that wasn't going to happen. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the trust that had been shattered in an instant. And trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. Every shift felt longer than the last, and the once comforting hum of the diner now felt like an oppressive silence that weighed on her shoulders. The regulars, the people who had been her customers for years, began to avoid eye contact. The usual morning greetings were replaced with awkward nods, and the conversations that once flowed effortlessly now seemed stilted and forced. Even Tom, the cook who had always been a source of comfort with his dry humor, barely spoke to her. He'd always been someone Maria could count on for a laugh or a kind word, but now he just seemed to focus on his work, avoiding her as if her presence was something to be endured rather than welcomed. Maria tried to push through it. She focused on her work, serving plates of food, refilling coffee cups, and making small talk with the customers. But the suspicion that hung in the air like a storm cloud never lifted. It was hard to keep up appearances, to smile and chat as if everything were fine, when she felt like she was drowning inside. No one said anything outright, but Maria could feel it, the whispers, the glances, the way people looked at her like she was a stranger. It was as though the entire town had turned its back on her without even giving her a chance to explain. The worst part was Mr. Henderson's silence. He didn't confront her again after that first meeting in the office, but his actions spoke louder than words. He stopped coming by to check in with her like he used to. He stopped asking how her day was going or if she needed anything. He kept his distance, almost as if he were waiting for her to slip up. She could feel his distrust in the way he handled the cash register, in the way he glanced at her when she passed by. His coldness was like a dagger to her heart. One evening, after the dinner rush had died down and the last few patrons had left, Maria found herself alone in the diner with Mr. Henderson. She had just finished wiping down the tables, and as she turned to head into the back room, she was stopped by his voice. "Maria," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "Come here for a minute." She hesitated for a moment, then walked over to where he stood behind the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something about the way he spoke, so direct, so clinical, that made her feel like she was about to be interrogated again. "I've been thinking about things," he said, his eyes scanning the counter as if he was searching for something that wasn't there. "And I've come to a decision." Maria's stomach twisted. She tried to read his expression, but it was unreadable. His face was a mask, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. "I've decided that I need to be sure," he continued. "You say you didn't take the money, but I need to know for certain." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had no idea where this was going, but she was terrified of what he might say next. "I'm going to have to check you," he said bluntly. "For the money. If you didn't steal it, then there's nothing to hide." Maria felt a wave of shock wash over her. It was as if the room had gone silent, as if the air had been sucked out of the diner entirely. She blinked, trying to process his words, but they didn't make sense. Was he really suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? I don't understand," Maria stammered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, his voice growing more firm, "I need you to strip. If you didn't take anything, then you have nothing to hide, right?" Maria's breath caught in her throat. Her body froze. She could feel her knees tremble, her hands suddenly clammy. The idea of being humiliated like this, of being forced to strip in front of him, her boss, the man who had known her for years, was beyond anything she could have imagined. It was degrading. It was wrong. And yet, there was an undeniable part of her that wanted to prove him wrong, to show that she wasn't guilty, that she wasn't the thief he suspected her to be. "I'm not stealing anything," she protested, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. "I swear I didn't take it." "I know," Mr. Henderson replied, his voice cold. "But this is the only way to be sure." Maria stared at him, the silence between them stretching out like an eternity. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, could feel his eyes boring into her. She wanted to shout at him, to scream that this was madness, that he was crossing a line. But instead, she found herself caught in a web of uncertainty. If she didn't comply, would he fire her? Would he tell the whole town she was guilty, even though she was innocent? If she did comply, would it prove something, anything, that could clear her name? She was stuck in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "I'll do it," she finally said, her voice barely audible. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she said them anyway. It was the only option left. The only way to show that she was innocent. Mr. Henderson didn't say anything. He simply turned his back and walked to the far side of the diner, as if giving her some semblance of privacy. But it didn't matter. The humiliation was already sinking in. She had always been a proud person, but now, in this moment, she felt small, so small that she couldn't bear to meet her own reflection in the glass of the diner window. Slowly, methodically, Maria began to remove her apron, her uniform, piece by piece. She could feel her heart racing, pounding in her chest, and the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. She wanted to shout at Mr. Henderson, to demand that he take back what he had said, to tell him that this wasn't the answer, that she didn't deserve this. But the words wouldn't come. The silence was suffocating. When she was finished, she stood there, exposed and vulnerable, her clothes in a pile at her feet. She wanted to cover herself, to hide away from the world, but she didn't. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, waiting for Mr. Henderson to speak. The seconds felt like hours. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the humiliation flooding through her veins. It was the most degrading moment of her life. And all for what? To prove to him that she wasn't a thief? Finally, Mr. Henderson turned around. His eyes swept over her, but they didn't linger. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he walked over to the counter, opened the drawer, and pulled out a small, crumpled bag of money. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed it before, but now, it was clear. The money wasn't hers. And it wasn't from the register either. He looked at her, his eyes softening for just a moment. "It wasn't you," he said quietly. "It was Jane." Maria stood there, still in shock, still trying to process what had just happened. The truth was out. The money had been stolen, but not by her. The weight of it all hit her like a freight train. And yet, as the shame and confusion washed over her, there was only one thing she could think about. How had she gotten here? How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? The aftermath of that night lingered in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm that had only just passed, leaving destruction in its wake. Maria stood there in the middle of the diner, the strange silence wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating blanket. She was still exposed, still vulnerable, her dignity shattered in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, despite everything, she stood there, processing the revelation that Jane, the quiet, seemingly harmless waitress who had been working alongside her for the past few months, was the one who had been stealing the money. Maria could still feel the rush of shock that had swept through her when Mr. Henderson had turned around, holding the crumpled bag of money in his hand like a trophy. She could still hear his voice, the way it had softened when he realized his mistake. "It wasn't you," he had said, as if he was trying to soothe her, trying to undo the damage that had already been done. But there was no undoing it. The humiliation she felt wasn't something that could be erased with a few words. No apology could fix what had happened, no justification could bring back the trust she had lost. Mr. Henderson had made his decision, and it had been based on an assumption that had cost Maria her pride, her reputation, and, in some ways, her very sense of self. As the moments passed, Maria's body slowly came back to life. She looked at her clothes lying in a crumpled heap on the floor and quickly pulled them back on, her hands shaking with the effort. She didn't look at Mr. Henderson as she dressed. She didn't want to. She didn't want to see the pity in his eyes, the regret that now clouded his features. The truth had come out, but it didn't make her feel any better. It only left her feeling more isolated, more alone. Finally, she spoke, her voice a quiet whisper that felt foreign in her own mouth. "Why didn't you trust me?" she asked, the question hanging between them, her words thick with the pain she had been holding back since the first accusation had been made. Mr. Henderson didn't immediately respond. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, before he finally sighed and set the bag of stolen money on the counter. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. I should have believed you. I should have trusted you, Maria." Maria shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. Her throat was tight, and her chest ached with a combination of anger and betrayal. How could he have done this to her? How could he have put her through all that for nothing? "You should have," she muttered bitterly, her voice trembling as the full weight of the humiliation she had endured in the past few days crashed over her once again. There was a long silence between them, one that neither of them seemed willing to break. Maria wanted to say more, to yell, to demand an explanation, but she didn't. What would be the point? The damage was done. The words had been spoken. There was no going back. She was just finished. "I'm sorry, Maria," he said again, his voice barely audible. "I truly am." But the apology didn't matter anymore. She couldn't hear it, couldn't accept it. The man she had trusted, the man she had worked for and respected for years, had believed the worst of her. He had let suspicion overshadow the bond they had built over time. There were no simple words that could take that pain away. Maria's mind swirled with emotions, but her body felt numb. Her legs were heavy, like lead, and she knew that if she didn't leave now, she would break down. She had to get out of there. She had to leave this place behind, at least for a little while. Without another word, she turned and walked towards the door, ignoring the sting of tears that threatened to fall. As she reached for the handle, she heard Mr. Henderson call out to her once again, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The world outside the diner felt like the only place left for her. The cool night air would cleanse her, would give her some semblance of peace, even if only for a few moments. The door swung open, and Maria stepped outside, the familiar sounds of Brooksville's quiet streets greeting her with a strange sense of relief. The night had fallen completely now, and the streets were nearly empty except for a few scattered cars and the distant hum of streetlights. She could feel the weight of the day pressing on her chest, but as she took a deep breath, the cold air seemed to cut through the fog of confusion and hurt. She had no idea what she was supposed to do next, but she knew that she couldn't stay here. She walked down the empty street, her steps slow and deliberate, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about Jane. Jane, the woman who had stolen from the diner, the woman who had betrayed Maria's trust in the most unexpected way. They had never been close. Jane was quiet, always keeping to herself, always blending into the background, but Maria had never suspected her. Not once. And now, the truth came crashing down, revealing how little she truly knew about the people around her. As she walked, Maria's thoughts turned inward. What had she done wrong? Was there something she could have done differently? Maybe she could have been more vigilant, noticed the small signs that something was off. Maybe she should have questioned Jane when she saw her acting strangely that one evening. But hindsight was always clearer than the present, and Maria had no answers. She was left with the burning question of why why had Jane done this to her, to the diner, to the community? Was it just a momentary lapse in judgment, a moment of desperation? Or had it been something deeper, something darker? Maria didn't have the answers. She didn't know how to make sense of any of it. She didn't even know what her next step would be. But one thing was certain, she couldn't go back to the Sunnyside diner, not yet, anyway. The trust that had been broken was too deep, too raw for her to face again, not without time and space to process everything that had happened. Maybe one day, things could return to normal, but that day felt far off. For now, all she could do was walk away. Her feet carried her toward the outskirts of town, where the familiar landmarks of Brooksville faded into the darkness. The town had always felt like home, but now, it felt like a stranger's place, familiar, yet distant. Maria didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to keep walking. She had to put some distance between herself and the memories of the diner, the accusations, the humiliation. The next few weeks were a blur of pain, reflection, and rebuilding. Maria didn't return to the diner right away. She couldn't. She needed time to heal, to rediscover who she was outside of the role she had played for so long. The trust that had been broken would take time to rebuild, and she wasn't sure if she could ever trust Mr. Henderson again. The man who had believed in her, who had given her a job when she needed it most, had now cast doubt on everything she stood for. And the woman she had once called a coworker, a friend of sorts, had turned out to be someone she didn't know at all. As Maria reflected on everything that had transpired, she realized that she would never be the same person again. The events of those days had changed her, perhaps irrevocably. But she was determined to find a way to move forward, to find peace in the chaos. It wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't one to give up. There were lessons to be learned, mistakes to be acknowledged, but Maria knew one thing for certain: she would rise above this. She would not let it define her. And so, with the weight of the past behind her and the uncertain future ahead, Maria began to rebuild. Slowly, step by step, she pieced herself back together, knowing that it was only through embracing the brokenness that she could heal. It would take time, but Maria had learned that sometimes, it was the hardest experiences that shaped you the most, teaching you who you truly were when everything else fell away. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of the events at the Sunnyside diner continued to hang heavily over Maria's life. The small town of Brooksville, where everyone seemed to know everyone's business, had witnessed a dramatic shift, one that left Maria in a kind of quiet exile. The once familiar streets now felt like a maze, every corner a reminder of the betrayal and hurt that had unfolded. Each time Maria walked past the diner, she felt the sting of the memories, the ghosts of the humiliation that had defined those few days. It wasn't just the diner that had changed, it was everything. The people she had once seen as friends, the place she had worked for years, all of it had been warped by the events that had unfolded there. At first, Maria tried to bury herself in other things, to distract herself from the relentless tide of thoughts that threatened to consume her. She spent hours going through her old books, rearranging the shelves in a futile attempt to create some sense of order. She took walks through the woods behind her house, where the sounds of nature provided a brief respite from the noise inside her head. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the truth: the diner, and everything that had happened there, had irrevocably altered her life. And she was still struggling to find her way through the wreckage. It wasn't until one fateful afternoon that Maria felt the first flicker of something that could pass for hope. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee, when the phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something deep inside told her she should pick it up. "Hello?" she answered, her voice tentative. "Maria?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but strained, filled with uncertainty. "It's Tom. I need to talk to you." Tom. The cook at the diner. The one person who had always treated her with kindness, the one person who had shared inside jokes and long conversations during the quieter shifts. He had always been her ally, and hearing his voice now brought a mix of emotions, curiosity, wariness, and a flicker of something else, the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for closure. "Tom," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's going on? How are you?" There was a long pause, and Maria could almost hear Tom's hesitation on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost apologetic. I know things haven't been good. I know you've been hurt by everything that happened. And I know you haven't been back to the diner, and I get it. But Maria, we need you. The diner needs you." Maria felt a strange mix of emotions stir within her chest. Her first instinct was to tell him that she had no intention of going back, that she couldn't bear the thought of stepping foot in that place again. But there was something in his voice, something that made her pause. It wasn't desperation, exactly. It was more like a plea, an honest desire to make things right. "What do you mean?" Maria asked, her voice steady but guarded. "It's Jane," Tom continued, his words rushing out in a hurry. She's gone. She's not coming back. And things are falling apart without you, Maria. The customers are starting to notice. The place is losing its charm. People miss you, and I miss you." Maria's heart skipped a beat as she processed his words. Jane was gone. It didn't make sense. After everything that had happened, after the way Maria had been humiliated, after the trust that had been shattered, why would they even want her back? "Tom, I don't think I can come back," Maria said quietly, the weight of her emotions threatening to choke her. "After everything that happened, I don't know if I can face that place again. Not after what Mr. Henderson did. Not after what Jane did." There was another pause, and then Tom's voice softened. "I get it, Maria. I do. But I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. What happened with Jane, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. She lied to all of us. And Mr. Henderson, he made a mistake. We all did. But that doesn't mean you have to leave. We need you there. The diner isn't the same without you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Maria was silent, her mind racing. She had always thought of the Sunnyside Diner as more than just a job. It had been her sanctuary, a place where she had found a sense of belonging, a place where she had been able to share her life with the people who came through its doors. She had built relationships there, and now, everything was broken. Or was it? Could she really go back, knowing that the people who had once been her co-workers were still there, still struggling with the aftermath of what had happened? "I'm not sure I can forgive him," Maria said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust him again. Not after what he did." Tom's voice was patient, understanding. "I know, Maria. It's going to take time. But if you want, we can take it slow. You don't have to jump back into everything at once. Just come by, visit. See how it feels. We can start there." Maria felt a surge of emotions wash over her. She didn't know if she was ready to face the diner again, but there was something in Tom's voice that made her think she wasn't alone in all of this. He had always been there for her, in his own quiet way, and maybe, just maybe, he could help her find her way back. Maybe the diner wasn't lost after all. Maybe there was a chance for healing, for rebuilding. "I'll think about it," Maria said softly, her voice full of uncertainty but also the smallest hint of hope. "But I'm not promising anything." Tom chuckled lightly on the other end of the line. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it. Come by when you're ready." With that, the call ended, and Maria sat in silence, the phone still pressed to her ear. She wasn't sure what she expected from the conversation, but something inside her had shifted. There was no quick fix for the mess that had been made, no way to erase the pain or the betrayal. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward. The diner had always been a part of her life, and it was clear that even now, it still held a place in her heart. Maria spent the next few days reflecting on her conversation with Tom. She took long walks, contemplating what it would mean to return to the place that had once felt like home. She wasn't sure she was ready, but she also realized that she couldn't hide forever. The world outside was moving forward, and if she didn't start taking steps to rebuild her own life, she might get left behind. She found herself standing in front of the Sunnyside Diner one crisp morning, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar red and white striped awning seemed to greet her with open arms, but the memories of what had happened here flooded back in waves, threatening to pull her under. But then she thought of Tom, and of the other people who still believed in her, who still needed her. Maybe it wasn't about forgiving Mr. Henderson right away, or erasing the pain of the past. Maybe it was about taking small steps forward, letting herself heal at her own pace. With a deep breath, Maria pushed open the door of the diner and stepped inside. The familiar sounds of sizzling grills and clinking silverware greeted her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Maria stepped into the diner, the familiar bell above the door ringing softly as it swung open. She had imagined this moment countless times over the past few weeks, each time with a mix of dread and hope. Now, standing at the threshold, she realized that it wasn't the diner itself that intimidated her, it was the people inside, the memories that lingered, and the difficult task of finding her way back after everything that had happened. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, her eyes scanning the interior. The smells of bacon and freshly brewed coffee still hung in the air, and the chatter of customers filled the space with a comforting hum. But it was different now. There was a subtle tension, an awareness that the fabric of this place had been torn and was now in the process of being mended. Tom was at the counter when she walked in, his back to the door as he scrambled eggs on the grill. He didn't see her at first, and for a moment, Maria almost turned back. She almost left, afraid to disrupt the delicate balance that seemed to hang over the diner. But then, without warning, Tom turned around and saw her standing there. His eyes widened, and a slow smile spread across his face. He wiped his hands on his apron and quickly made his way over to her. "You came," he said, his voice full of surprise and something like relief. Maria nodded, a small, uncertain smile tugging at her lips. "I said I'd think about it," she said softly, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I didn't want to stay away forever." "Good," Tom said, his smile widening. "Good to have you back, Maria." There was a warmth in his voice, an unspoken understanding that Maria hadn't expected. For a moment, everything felt a little less heavy, as though maybe, just maybe, she could start to rebuild something here. Not everything would be the same, and there would still be awkward moments and painful reminders, but this was a start. She wasn't sure what the future held, but the fact that she had returned felt like a small victory. As Tom led her to a booth in the corner, Maria looked around the diner. It hadn't changed much since she'd last been there, the tables were the same, the jukebox in the corner still played a soft, nostalgic tune. The walls were lined with pictures of Brooksville from years gone by, capturing moments of a simpler time. But there was something different now. The din of conversation, the clatter of dishes, all seemed a little quieter, as though the place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back," Tom said as he set a coffee cup in front of her. "After everything that went down, it wasn't easy for any of us. But I'm glad you're here." Maria took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth of it spread through her. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "But I guess I needed some time to think. I couldn't just walk away, not without giving this a chance." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. But Maria, you know it wasn't your fault, right? None of it. What happened with Jane, it was all on her. And Mr. Henderson, he didn't mean for it to go down the way it did. He made a mistake, and he knows it. Maria sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup. I know. But that doesn't make it easier, Tom. You don't just forget something like that. It feels like everything I worked for, everything I trusted, just disappeared in an instant. I don't know if I can get that back. There was a long silence between them, and Maria could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. She wasn't sure what she wanted to hear from Tom, but she needed something, some reassurance that things could still be repaired, that there was still hope for the diner, for her. But Tom didn't offer any easy answers. Instead, he just nodded, as if acknowledging that this wasn't something that could be solved in a few words. You don't have to fix it all at once, Tom said after a moment, his voice calm and steady. It'll take time. And you don't have to trust anyone but yourself. But if you ever need anything, Maria, we're here. The diner, the people, we're here. And I'm here. Maria felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive Mr. Henderson or to fully embrace the idea of returning to work here, but Tom's words gave her something she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of connection, of belonging. She wasn't alone in this. There were people who still cared, people who wanted her to be a part of something again. As she sat there, sipping her coffee, she felt the faintest stirrings of hope, a hope that had been buried under the weight of so many unanswered questions and unresolved emotions. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe it wouldn't be perfect. But there was something here, something worth fighting for. The diner wasn't just a place, it was a part of her story, a part of her life, and it always would be. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make it work again. The rest of the day passed in a quiet blur, with Maria simply observing the rhythm of the diner. She wasn't ready to dive back into the work just yet, but she felt herself slowly easing back into the familiar atmosphere. Tom had been right, the diner had changed, but not as much as she had feared. People still came in for their morning coffee and the comfort of their usual booths. The chatter, the clink of cutlery, the sounds of the kitchen, all of it was just as she remembered. And yet, it was different now. There was a new layer of understanding, a new level of quiet resolve. Around mid-afternoon, Mr. Henderson arrived. His face was drawn, tired, but he still carried himself with the same air of authority that he always had. Maria felt a tightness in her chest as she saw him enter, but she didn't look away. She knew she had to face him eventually. She had to see him, not as the man who had accused her unjustly, but as the man who had been through his own reckoning, who had made his own mistakes. He saw her sitting at the booth and paused for a moment, his eyes locking with hers. He seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to do, and for a brief moment, it was as though time stood still. But then, slowly, he walked over to her table. Maria, he said quietly, his voice rough. I owe you an apology. Maria didn't say anything at first. She simply met his gaze, feeling a mix of emotions rise within her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him yet, but she wasn't sure what else she could do either. They had both made mistakes, he had misjudged her, but in doing so, he had revealed something important. He had revealed that, even in the face of betrayal, he still cared about the diner and the people who worked there. He still cared about the community they had built together. I'm sorry too, Maria said finally, her voice steady but soft. I didn't make it easy on you either. Mr. Henderson nodded, his expression one of regret. We've both made mistakes, Maria. But I hope we can fix this. I know I've lost your trust, but I'll do whatever it takes to earn it back. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Maria looked at him for a long moment, considering his words. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be moments of doubt and hesitation. But something about his sincerity made her think that maybe, just maybe, they could begin to rebuild. Not just the diner, but the trust that had been broken. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be without its challenges, but it was a start. "I'll think about it," Maria said again, this time with more conviction than before. "But it's going to take time." And so, with that simple acknowledgement, the first step toward healing had been taken. Maria didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone. She had Tom. She had the diner. And maybe, with a little time, even Mr. Henderson could be a part of the story again. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. As she looked out the window of the diner, watching the sun begin to set over Brooksville, Maria felt a sense of calm wash over her. There was still much to be done, many pieces to be put back in place, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She wasn't sure where the road would take her, but she was ready to walk it. And maybe, just maybe, the diner would be waiting for her at the end of it. The following weeks were a delicate dance for Maria, a balancing act between reconciling her past with the possibilities of her future. Every day felt like a small victory, each step taken toward regaining the rhythm of life at the diner. There were moments when the weight of everything, of what had happened, of the years she had given to this place, almost seemed too heavy to bear. But she pressed on, day by day, learning how to navigate the emotions, the awkward silences, and the rebuilding of relationships that had been fractured. The diner, once the place where she had found both solace and frustration, became a place of reflection and quiet growth. Tom had been her steady rock throughout this period. His presence in the diner was calming, and he never once made her feel as though she was being pushed to move faster than she was ready for. He understood the subtle shifts in her mood, the fleeting moments of hesitation, the silent battles that raged within her. Every morning, when she stepped behind the counter to start her shift, Tom would greet her with a warm smile and an encouraging word. He knew that her return wasn't just about serving food and drinks, it was about finding a way to reconnect with herself and the people she had once called coworkers, friends. It wasn't long before Maria found herself slipping back into the routine, the once familiar rhythm of the diner filling the void that had been so painfully absent. She took her time, working side by side with Tom, gradually easing back into the role she had once occupied with such ease. The clinking of plates, the sizzle of the grill, the hum of conversation, it all felt so natural. But still, the shadow of what had happened with Mr. Henderson lingered, a quiet presence in the background of each shift. She had yet to truly speak with him, to confront the heart of the issue that had pushed her away in the first place. Despite his apology, despite his efforts to make amends, there was still a part of Maria that wasn't sure if she could ever trust him again. It was something she would have to confront eventually, but she wasn't ready to do so just yet. She needed time. One late afternoon, as Maria was wiping down a table near the front window, she saw a familiar face walk in. It was Jane, the waitress who had once been her close friend, the one who had left the diner under such mysterious and unpleasant circumstances. Maria's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening as she saw Jane approach the counter. She hadn't expected to see her again, let alone so soon. The last time they had spoken, it had been on that disastrous night when everything had come crashing down. Jane's departure had been abrupt, and her reasons had never been fully explained to Maria. There had been whispers, rumors, but Maria hadn't wanted to believe any of them. Still, seeing Jane now, standing in front of her, as if no time had passed, filled her with a mix of emotions. Jane's eyes flickered toward Maria, and for a brief moment, there was a tense silence between them. Neither of them spoke, and for the first time, Maria realized how much their friendship had been fractured by the events that had transpired. Jane's gaze dropped, and she looked away, as though unsure how to proceed. Maria's heart ached as she studied her former friend, but she also couldn't shake the sense that something had changed, something deeper than what had happened on the surface. She had heard bits and pieces of Jane's side of the story, but she had never been given the chance to understand it fully. Taking a deep breath, Maria walked over to the counter, where Jane had taken a seat. The awkwardness between them hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. For a moment, neither of them said anything, both unsure of where to start. But Maria couldn't let it go on like this. She had to know the truth. "Jane," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. "What happened? Why did you leave like that?" Jane glanced up at her, her face filled with an unreadable expression. There was guilt, yes, but also something else, something that Maria couldn't quite place. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, as though weighing her words carefully. I didn't want it to end like this," Jane said, her voice quiet and full of regret. "You know, I never meant for things to go down the way they did. I never meant for you to get caught up in all of it." Maria's heart twisted as she listened to Jane's words. There was something in her tone, something that made Maria believe she wasn't lying. But still, the betrayal, the silence that had followed her departure, was hard to forget. "Then why didn't you come back?" Maria asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why didn't you try to explain yourself? We could have talked about it. We could have figured it out together." Jane looked down at her hands, as though trying to find the right words. "I didn't know how," she admitted softly. "I didn't know if you would ever forgive me. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I could forgive myself." Maria felt a pang of sympathy for Jane, but it was mixed with her own hurt. "You didn't just leave the diner, Jane. You left everything behind. You left me behind." There was a long silence between them, and for a moment, Maria wasn't sure if they could ever truly heal from the rift between them. But then Jane looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and sincerity. "I know," Jane said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I should have done things differently. I let fear get the best of me, and I made a decision that I regret every day." Maria studied her for a moment, trying to read her expression, trying to make sense of the person sitting across from her. She realized that, in some ways, she had been waiting for an apology, waiting for Jane to explain herself, to take responsibility for what had happened. But the apology wasn't enough, not anymore. Too much time had passed, too much damage had been done. Maria couldn't simply erase the past, no matter how much she wanted to. "I don't know what to say, Jane," Maria said slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I'm glad you came back. Maybe we can figure this out. But I can't promise anything." Jane nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And I'm here, if you ever want to talk." Maria sat back in silence, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know what to make of it, or if forgiveness was even possible at this point. But one thing was clear, this was another step in the long process of healing, for both of them. The past wasn't something that could be erased in a single conversation, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Maria felt like she could breathe again. The road ahead would still be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but maybe, just maybe, there was room for redemption, for herself and for Jane. As Jane stood to leave, she gave Maria a small, tentative smile. "I'll see you around," she said quietly. Maria nodded, watching as Jane walked out the door. She didn't know what the future held for their friendship, or for her life at the diner, but she knew one thing: she was no longer running away. She was facing everything, every painful memory, every unanswered question, and taking the first steps toward healing. It was going to be a long journey, but she wasn't walking it alone. And in that moment, Maria realized something important: the past might have shaped her, but it didn't define her. The future was hers to create, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it. The doors of the Sunnyside diner swung open again, and the familiar sounds of clinking dishes and gentle chatter filled the air. Maria wasn't sure where she was headed next, but as she looked around the diner, she felt a sense of peace, a quiet hope that things could be different. One step at a time.